Hello and welcome back to the Mojave, everybody. Welcome back to Fallout New Vegas, where today we're going to be taking a look at a set of weapons in the unarmed class. We're going to be taking a look at boxing tape, boxing gloves, and the golden gloves, which are the unique boxing gloves, in this video. I decided to put all these together because they're all sort of the same type of weapon and they all sort of have the same type of things, even though boxing tape can't be used to repair things like boxing gloves. It just felt kind of weird to keep that as its own video when we already have other boxing things. Again, if you guys would like to see bare hands too as one of these, feel free to ask, because that one has been requested a couple of times too, and I keep forgetting about it whenever I go over the unarmed weapons. So these are all fairly early game weapons besides golden gloves, which you can find once you get to the strip, but boxing gloves and tape both can be found all over the wasteland. They're usually found just in like lockers. It's fairly uncommon for enemies to actually have something like boxing gloves. Boxing tape, sometimes powder gangers and raiders can actually have it, but even then it's still kind of rare, at least compared to something like brass knuckles or spike knuckles. Those are a more common unarmed weapon that you're going to find. For the base stats of boxing tape, this one requires 0 unarmed and 1 strength to wield, which is great. That means any character can effectively wield boxing tape. I would certainly hope so, since it's just tape on your hands. This makes it so you do 4 damage per hit, which is extremely low. It has 5 damage per second, which is also very low. These things don't attack super fast. This has 4 crit damage to it, again very low. 1 times crit modifier, so you don't even get bonus crits with this. This costs 28 action points, which is fairly high, even for an unarmed weapon like this. I don't know why it's as high as it is, especially since we've already talked about like brass knuckles and spike knuckles, and they have a lot less action point cost. Boxing tape does weigh only a quarter of a weight. It weighs 0.25 weight, so it is one of the lightest items in the entire game. Definitely one of the lightest weapons in the entire game, which is kind of cool. This also has 500 item health, making it so it actually has a huge health pool overall, especially at the very start of the game. You're probably not going to be breaking boxing tape anytime soon, and even if you do, it's going to be super cheap to repair, either just finding more tape to fix it, or finding a vendor that would fix it and they're not going to charge you very much for it. I guess you could even use weapon repair kits, but I don't think that's a good use of your weapon repair kits on any build, unless you're specifically going for like a boxing only run or something like that. And all of the boxing gear also has a unique effect to it where it can inflict fatigue damage. The boxing tape is plus 20 fatigue damage per hit. Fatigue damage makes it so once this damage builds up, it will knock the enemy down onto the ground and then they become immobilized for a certain amount of time. You can then just proceed to wail on them or run away or whatever it might be. This actually does make it kind of interesting for like a pacifist run, where or at least a no-kill run. I'm not sure if you would really want to consider a pacifist run, but so long as you're not killing anything, you could just punch something until it's knocked out and laying on the ground, and then you carry on about your day. Boxing tape does allow you to do that. Let's talk about the pros and cons to this weapon that also kind of span the other weapons. Then we'll go back to the other stats of the boxing gloves and the golden gloves. So for the pros of boxing tape, this one does have really high item health. All the gloves actually have pretty high item health. Boxing tape has the most at 500. Then boxing gloves are at 200 and golden gloves are 250, which is all fine. That makes it so they're not going to break very quick whatsoever. They all have the fatigue damage, which is pretty unique. That's pretty good. Boxing tape in particular has 2 more advantages that the boxing gloves don't though. One is the low weight overall. With boxing tape only weighing a quarter of a weight, it is super lightweight and you might as well grab it if you can. You can at least sell it for a couple of bucks if nothing else, and if you want to use it, by all means go for it. It's not going to weigh you down whatsoever. And then boxing tape is also considered a holdout weapon, so you can sneak it right into any casino. Whether you should do this or not, I would say probably not, just because brass knuckles and spike knuckles do exist. They're also holdout weapons and they are just way better than boxing tape. But assuming you just rush right to the strip, then this is fine. You can use the boxing tape just to get right in if you would like to. And then at least you have some sort of weapon to use inside of the casinos. There was also supposed to be a unique version of boxing tape that was cut from the game that was called Scarlet's Hand Wraps. This was supposed to be found in Dead Money. And this one actually did have decent-ish damage on it. Not great because it went up to 15 damage. That's still pretty high compared to the 4 damage that boxing tape actually has by default. For the general cons of this weapon, and just kind of all these weapons, they do have very low damage and they have very low damage per second, so killing things quickly is not really much of an option a lot of the time. Even if you have all of the different unarmed and melee perks that go along and make those builds so strong, like Piercing Strike, Slayer, Purifier, anything like that, you're still not killing things very fast. The best thing that you have to do is just knock enemies on the ground And then hopefully it's just one enemy where you can just keep wailing on them until they eventually die. It's going to take you a long time to do this, but it is a decent strat, at least in a one-on-one fight with just about anything. Other cons is that they fall off very hard. There's no real reason to be using boxing tape in the first place because brass knuckles and spike knuckles can be obtained so early on, and they are just a straight upgrade to these weapons. They just don't really help you that much. They even have really high item health like these. Maybe not as much as the boxing tape, because I think the highest is spike knuckles, at least Love and Hate, going up to like 250. So it's half the health of boxing tape, but that's still more than enough for most unarmed builds. And these ones have a weirdly high action point cost. Like 28 action points isn't necessarily super high by all weapon standards, but it is kind of high compared to other unarmed weapon standards. Like, I feel like that's the same as about a Power Fist action point cost, and I'm not going to be using this over something like a Power Fist if I'm going to be using VATS anyway. For an overall rating for boxing tape, at least, I would probably put this into the D tier. It at least has some sort of a niche where it's kind of useful because it doesn't weigh very much and it has a whole bunch of item health. So if you want to carry this around, especially with an unarmed build, and you're just like, I need to have something because I'm not finding brass or spike knuckles right away, and these at least have health and at least I can punch stuff, it at least fills that role where you won't have to be using your bare hands. Let's talk about boxing gloves and the golden gloves and their stats. So for boxing gloves, for the base stats of them, they also require 0 unarmed to wield and 1 strength, so any character can wield these effectively. They do a massive 1 damage per hit, 1 damage per second, 1 crit damage. They have a 1 times crit modifier, so okay, whatever. They still cost 28 action points, the same as the boxing tape does. They also weigh 6 weight, and they have 200 item health. I don't know why these things weigh 6 weight, but that's pretty heavy for the boxing gloves, especially considering boxing tape is just a quarter of a weight. They also do the fatigue damage as well. Boxing tape did 20 fatigue damage, boxing gloves do 35 fatigue damage, so you can knock down enemies faster than you would otherwise. This rarely matters though. Boxing gloves basically come with all of the same pros and cons of boxing tape, just they don't have as much item health, they weigh more. The fatigue damage doesn't matter that much, and they do even less damage and damage per second, so they're all around kind of a worse option than boxing tape most of the time, and I wouldn't really recommend that you build for them really on any build unless you're going with a pacifist run or you're going for a challenge run, in which case then maybe they might be decent. They have most of the same pros and cons, but you can't sneak boxing gloves into anywhere. I don't know why you would want to anyway. Again, boxing tape is just better than these, and that means for an overall rating for the boxing gloves, these are going to have to go to F tier because they are probably the worst unarmed option in the game. I would really never use these over any of the other unarmed options unless it is specifically for a challenge run that I'm trying. In which case then, yeah, absolutely, because that sounds kind of derpy and fun. Let's move on to the golden gloves, which the golden gloves, like I said, you can find in the Lucky 38. So as soon as you get to the strip, you can run right in there, and they are on the first floor. They are up above the bar in the first level. So on the casino, go over to the left-hand side, go up the stairs, and then they're just going to be sitting up there in a mantle. You can pull them out, and these ones look like a nicer pair of boxing gloves. They definitely look like they've been used a whole lot less, and they're yellow. Aside from that, they basically have all the same stats as the regular boxing gloves, though. They require 0 unarmed and 1 strength to wield. They do 1 damage per hit, 1 damage per second, 1 crit damage. They have a 2 times crit modifier, though, so you can get that 1 damage out even more, which I don't know why that matters, because crit damage also doesn't affect fatigue damage. Whether you hit a crit or not doesn't really matter. It's just the total amount of hits that you do that affect the fatigue damage. This one also costs 28 action points to use in VATS. This one weighs 6, and this one has 250 item health. The fatigue damage on this one is the best out of the group, though, doing 50 fatigue damage. So you have to hit people the least amount of times in order to knock them out with the boxing gloves, or with these golden gloves. Which is still not really that good. Knocking enemies out sounds fun, and it is fun, but it's not really that practical of a way to actually fight, especially considering the amount of hits that it takes to knock out enemies can sometimes vary based on the enemy. And if you have something like, again, spike knuckles or brass knuckles, you can probably kill the enemy before you would have knocked them out anyway. So that makes for a better option. Weighing 6 is still kind of high for an unarmed weapon that doesn't really do much besides knock enemies out. Yeah, these ones are also going to go into the F tier for weapons as well. I don't think golden gloves are all that great unless, again, you're doing a specific challenge run build, in which case then, yeah, they can be pretty fun. They can be pretty good in that role. You're doing a pacifist run, but even if you're doing technically like a fatigue build, This is not the best way to inflict fatigue. Punching these enemies is the earliest way that you can do this, I believe, but you can do this a lot faster if you have something like a riot shotgun and you load it with beanbags. You're going to knock out enemies really quick, and especially if you put and stand back on that, yeah, you're going to knock out anything that comes near you, and that can be super fun, and I think that build would be a little bit better and a lot safer to use than necessarily like the boxing gloves or the boxing tape. Interestingly enough though, you can actually use boxing tape for one additional thing. It's one additional challenge that's in the game, which is called the Deathclaw Pro Hunter, which you have to kill 5 adult Deathclaws with using low-leveled weapons. These include weapons like the 22 pistol, the switchblade, the recharger rifle, dynamite, and the boxing tape. And boxing tape is actually probably the easiest to do this with out of any of these weapons, because again, if you have the fatigue damage, you can potentially knock them down, and if it's just a one-on-one fight, if they're down on the ground, you'll beat them to death, but it's going to be pretty slow, so that is still an option because they can't fight back. And if you have Super Slam, this makes it so you have a higher chance of knocking those enemies down and then punching them. It's kind of the same thing with the Switchblade, but you have to rely more on the Super Slam actually taking effect, whereas Boxing Tape can actually just knock them down thanks to that once, and then you just keep beating on them so that they can't get back up. Tell me your thoughts on the Boxing Tape and the Boxing Gloves down in the comments below. Have you ever really used these? Do you enjoy using them? I actually do enjoy using at least the Boxing Tape from time to time because I find it funny just to knock enemies out. Boxing Gloves I rarely use unless, again, it's like in a challenge run or something, or maybe it could happen in a randomized run. That could also be pretty funny. Thank you guys so very much for watching this. Welcome back to Fallout New Vegas, where we're going back to basics, where we're going all caveman mode on anything and punching stuff with our knuckles. Not with our bare hands. I might make a video on that if you guys would like to see just bare hands, how good are they? But this time we're going to be talking about all of the knuckles, sort of. There's a couple other things that look sort of like knuckles as well in this game. But this will be the brass knuckles, spike knuckles, and the unique spike knuckles, since technically they're all sort of the same family, kind of. They all have their own stat lines and everything, so it's a little bit different. But even without the perk jury rigging, you can actually fix all these together with one another. So if you wanted to, you could fix your spike knuckles up with brass knuckles without even needing a perk, which is pretty awesome. The brass knuckles are probably going to be one of the very first unarmed weapons that you find. They're not going to be your first because you start out with your bare hands, so I guess that counts as one right away. And you may not find it before you find maybe boxing gloves or boxing tape. Boxing tape I tend to find first, but brass knuckles are usually a very quick second to find. So for the base stats of the brass knuckles, this one requires 25 unarmed, which is not super high. I mean, you're probably going to go for that if you're going with an unarmed build anyway, so getting that right at the start isn't a big deal. This only requires 2 strength, so basically anybody can wield it. This one does pretty good damage per hit at 18. That's not bad for an early game weapon. This one does 37 damage per second, which is pretty good by itself too. You can attack fairly fast with brass knuckles. This one has 18 crit damage, which is what you would kind of expect for a weapon like this. It has a 1x crit modifier, so nothing crazy there. Only costs 18 action points to use. Brass knuckles are actually a really good action point weapon. Most unarmed and melee weapons are actually pretty good for this, at least one-handed weapons. Sometimes the two-handed weapons cost a lot. Faster melee or unarmed options tend to have very low action point cost, so they're really good for a VATS build. Plus you do get access to all of the different unarmed and melee attacks based on your unarmed or melee. At least with unarmed, you do unlock different ones, like you can do cross attacks or uppercuts whenever you're in VATS, which will allow you to have a little bit more damage overall, which is pretty cool, but it will cost extra action points depending on what you're using. These ones only weigh 1, so they're incredibly lightweight as you would kind of expect them to be, and this has a 200 health pool on it, which is pretty good. That's actually really high compared to most early game melee or unarmed weapons, besides maybe like boxing tape, which I think is like 350. Brass knuckles do not break very fast, which is really good for an unarmed or melee build, which you're probably going to be speccing into both if you're taking one or the other. So getting a pair of brass knuckles early on is really, really nice. You can usually beat through most of the early game enemies, no problem. And there's a couple of perks that we should probably talk about with this too that make it even stronger. Slayer is one of the best melee and unarmed perks, and probably just one of the best perks in the entire game, as it just allows you to attack 30% faster with everything. That's really good. You can also have Piercing Strike, which is one of the best perks in the game too, as it allows you to have 15 or minus 15 damage threshold towards any target. So you're just completely ignoring basically every light armor in the game and almost all medium armors in the game whenever you're punching or stabbing somebody. And it's only going to be heavy armors that kind of resist your hits. And even then, if it's like metal armor, you're still going to go right through it. So it's going to have to be even tankier than that in order for it to actually stop you. That's really strong. Oh, Super Slam is another really strong perk too, because it allows you to just knock down enemies. And if you can knock down enemies, and they're not fighting back and it's a one-on-one fight, it becomes a real easy fight for you just to keep punching them when they're on the ground. So that's just a strong thing with melee and unarmed in general. For the pros of the brass knuckles, and I guess the spike knuckles too, since we're sort of talking about both, these all kind of fit for the pros and cons of each of these. The pros are that this one does do really high damage and pretty good damage per second in an early game. It also has really good item health, and all of these count as sneak-in items. So you can sneak these into any sort of holdout area, which they're very good, especially the spike knuckles. They're really strong in holdout areas, since even if you're not going for the unique version of them or you don't know where it is, then like even just picking up a pair of spike knuckles is surprisingly strong, even if you're not spec'd into melee or unarmed at all. These ones also have pretty low action point cost, so they're really good on a VATS build. Major con though to these weapons is that they do kind of fall off compared to other unarmed and melee weapons. They're not terrible by any means in terms of the fall off, but they're not as strong as certain other weapons can be. For all of this, I would put the brass knuckles into C tier. I think that they're a really good starting game weapon, and they can be a pretty good holdout weapon, but you will probably replace them with some of the other unarmed weapons as it goes on. Moving on to the spike knuckles, they require 50 unarmed and 3 strength, so more unarmed and more strength. However, you can still get spike knuckles pretty early on into the game, so finding them is not very difficult. Raiders can often have them too, and it can be really, really nice to find a pair of spike knuckles early on. This one does 25 damage per hit, which is pretty good. This one has 59 damage per second, which is also really good. This one does 25 crit damage, same as normal damage, has a 1x crit modifier, nothing crazy there. Costs 19 action points to use, 1 more point than brass knuckles, so they're usually going to be basically the same for you regardless of how you build, whether you're building for VATS or not with your unarmed build. They're both going to be pretty good. Brass knuckles are slightly better, but only slightly in terms of overall action points. This one only weighs 1 as well, and this one has 300 item HP, which is really high for an early game weapon. 300 item HP does take a while to go through, especially for the spike knuckles. You're probably not going to be breaking them anytime soon. And even if you do, it's not that huge of a deal, because if you can find a vendor that's selling brass knuckles, you can just fix up your spike knuckles with them. And you will probably find some raiders that either have spike knuckles that you can fix these with, or brass knuckles. So these are extremely durable, just like the brass knuckles are. Same type of pros and cons go for this weapon too. They don't fall off as hard as brass knuckles, so they are a little bit better. And I would probably put the spike knuckles a tier higher than the brass knuckles, up into B tier. They're all around a very solid weapon. They do tend to fall off later into the game, but not so much later, at least for an unarmed character. It's just that a lot of your weapons later with unarmed are pretty strong, and a lot of you kind of can sneak into areas, which makes them even better than something like this. So it's kind of like on a scale, but this is still a very, very good weapon, especially in the early game. It'd probably be even higher in the early game. And then we move on to the unique version called Love and Hate. This one you can find on a raider that is just north of Good Springs. You do have to kill this raider in order to get these, or I guess break them off of them and then steal them off the ground or something. I guess that would also count. And this raider is pretty strong. The raiders around there are pretty strong in general, because one of the raiders, at least one of the raider leaders, has reinforced metal armor, and he's also got a trail carbine, which hits pretty hard in the early game. This one, the spike knuckles hit pretty hard, and they also have plasma grenades, and they're wearing combat armor, which is all kind of a bad scenario early on in the game. But if you are strong enough to get through the Cazadors and go over there and fight them, then you can get a really, really strong early game weapon. So Love and Hate also requires 50 unarmed and 3 strength, same as regular spike knuckles. This one does 30 damage per hit. This one does 67 damage per second, so quite a bit more damage per second than the other options that we've talked about. Has 30 crit damage, which is fine. 1x crit modifier, which is fine. Also costs 19 action points, the same as the spike knuckles. Weighs 1 as well. And this one also has 300 item health, so it takes a very long time for this to break. This is probably one of the best early game options that you can get in terms of unarmed and in terms of melee. You can also get Chance's Knife by here, which I would say is a little bit better, mostly because of perks helping that one out more so. But in the early game, assuming you don't have any perks for either of them, they're both pretty comparable to one another, where they both have high damage. They're both pretty fast. They're both fairly durable. This one's actually even more durable, and they can both count as sneak-in weapons, which are probably 2 of the best weapons that you can sneak into areas. So Love and Hate, I would actually move up a tier from the spike knuckles, going up to A tier. They are a very solid option in the early game, a pretty solid option into the mid game, and still not a bad option into the late game. They do kind of still fall off compared to some of the late game unarmed weapons that you can get and that you can sneak into areas still, but they are among some of the best sneak-in weapons, and they still are one of the best early game weapons, just hands down. So in conclusion, should you use the brass knuckles or spike knuckles? I would say yeah, absolutely, if you're playing New Vegas. Even if you don't plan on going with an unarmed or a melee build, they're not that bad to take just for a sneak-in build, because even with just the base stats that they have, they're still pretty good. And you may not have guns or energy weapons, or if you're going with an explosives build, explosives just aren't that great for sneak-in weapons in general, because of all the problems that explosives can have. These might actually be a really good alternative for you to keep on you for any length of time, especially if you're worried about breaking your guns or anything like that, or you're running low on money. You don't really have to worry about breaking things like the brass or spike knuckles, because you're likely going to find another pair of brass or spike knuckles, or be able to buy a pair super cheap from vendors and then just fix up yours in the early game. And then, like I said, love and hate, it can actually carry you quite a ways in the game and is probably one of the better early game options just in general. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Scientist Gloves in Fallout New Vegas. Now there is 5 of these things, so there's quite a lot that you can pick. These are all found in the Old World Blues DLC. This is the 3rd DLC for Fallout, and these can be found in a variety of ways. Some of them are in specific locations. The regular Scientist Glove you can find just laying around in the area. Sometimes you find it in boxes. Sometimes the lobotomites have it as well, if they don't have the better Saturnite Fist, which is just kind of a better unarmed weapon overall. Let's talk about each of these, their stats, and what they're kind of good at and good against. So very first up, we have the Scientist Glove. And like I said, you can find this on lobotomites, or you can find it just laying around the DLC. This one requires 25 unarmed and 2 strength to wield, so most unarmed builds are going to be able to use this right away. That's not a big deal. This does 21 damage on hit, which is okay. That's not super high, but it's not super low either. 29 damage per second. These don't attack very fast. They have about the same attack speed as something like the Power Fist and the same attack animation, so they're kind of awkward to use in that regard. They have 5 crit damage. I don't know why the crit damage is so low on these things. It has an above average crit chance though, for some odd reason, of 1.5 times. So that's, I guess, kind of good, even though hitting crits doesn't really matter, at least with the regular Scientist Glove. And this one requires 28 action points to use in VATS, which is also not way great for the amount of damage it does. It weighs 2 weight, so it is affected by the Pack Rat perk, funny enough, and it only has 50 item health. There's also no additional effects with this. The regular Scientist Glove doesn't really have a whole lot going for it. The other versions have a whole lot more, and also there's no real reason for you to be using the Scientist Glove, because you can get the unique version, or one of the unique versions, right away, and the other versions you'll probably get throughout the rest of the DLC. So the regular Scientist Glove really doesn't have much of a purpose, unless you're specifically not using unique weapons and you're only using DLC weapons, in which case maybe it could be useful on an unarmed build, but even then, not really. For the pros of the Scientist Glove, these are very easy to find. Lobotomites tend to have them. You can find them in boxes. You can use them to repair other fist weapons, so that's kind of nice. You can use them to repair all of the Scientist Gloves. You don't even need jury rigging for that, so that is something that is good. The damage per second is okay, at least with some of the other versions. The regular one, not as much. Same with the damage. And there is a lot of unique versions to this, so I guess all of those are pros to the Scientist Glove. For the major cons though, it has very low item HP. It's going to break really fast, and it just has low stats all the way around. Low damage per second, low crits, extra crit chance, but that doesn't really matter when your crits aren't hitting that much harder. It does have all of the perks going for it though, like most unarmed and melee weapons, so you do actually have quite a few perks that affect these. Slayer is really good because increased attack speed, Piercing Strike for armor breaking, Super Slam to knock down enemies, Purifier to kill things like Deathclaws and super mutants and whatnot, and Pyromaniac actually works with this one, at least with one of these, with the Sterilizer Glove. It doesn't work with any of the others, but that one is technically considered a fire weapon, so that is nice that it actually gets more damage from Pyromaniac. For an overall rating for the Scientist Glove, I'd probably put this thing into like D tier. It's really not that great. It's probably one of the worst unarmed weapons in the entire game. It's still usable because it has okay enough damage, and unarmed and melee kind of carries itself thanks to perks, so it's not going to go into F tier, but it's definitely going to go very low D tier. Let's move on to some of the other unique versions of the glove that we got too. So we've got the Corrosive Glove. This is the green glove. This one requires 55 unarmed. Some of the Old World Blues weapons kind of have weird stats like this. It requires 2 strength as well. This one does the exact same damage as the Scientist Glove, doing 21. Actually does less damage per second at 23, so it attacks a little bit slower. This has a lower crit modifier at 1 times. Costs the same action points at 28. Weighs 4 weight in total, so it's twice as heavy as a regular glove, and it has 150 item health. So this one won't break very fast. That's nice. It also has a unique effect on top of that, where if you hit something, it will deal 2 damage to it for 10 seconds. It has like the same effect when you punch something as when you kill the spore people, where it kind of sprays that out, or when you kill some of the bugs when they pop. It's a little bit strange. This one is slightly better than the Scientist Glove, but not by very much. The corrosive damage over time doesn't really help you that much, and the damage per second and damage is still very low. At least this one doesn't break very fast, so this one's also going to go into D tier, slightly above the Scientist Glove, but not by that much. It's not really a great option. Our third glove is the Sterilizer Glove that we talked about, where it is actually affected by Pyromaniac, so you can get more damage and damage per second out of this, which is kind of useful. This one also requires 55 unarmed and 2 strength to wield. This one still does the 21 damage per hit, although that can be upped quite a bit by Pyromaniac, since that gives you 50% more damage, so that's actually kind of useful. Has the same DPS as the regular Scientist Glove, but again with Pyromaniac, that actually increases it quite a bit, so 29. Still does 5 crit damage, still has a 1x crit modifier, still costs 28 action points. This one only weighs 3, so it's a little bit better than the Corrosive Glove. This one has 200 item health, so it's not going to break quick at all. That's actually really nice for an unarmed weapon. And then this one does an additional fire damage on top of it, dealing 2 fire damage for 5 seconds. The main advantage this one has going for it is just simply that Pyromaniac affects it, and that makes it stronger by default. If you don't have Pyromaniac though, this is going to feel basically the same as the Corrosive Glove or the Scientist Glove, just if you want fire on it, you can have that. It's kind of a cool glove. I would put this one a tier higher than the other two, in the low C tier, but it's still not really that great. It's mostly Pyromaniac carrying it, and if you want to go with a fire weapon build, there's better fire weapons. Specifically in this DLC, there is a far better fire unarmed weapon if you want to use that. So I would just suggest that you take a look at the Saturnite Fist Superheated. That one is way, way better, and it's just one of the best unarmed weapons in the game. For our fourth glove, we have Dr. Klein's Glove. You can find this one like right at the very start of the DLC, so you might as well grab Dr. Klein's Glove over any of the other gloves, at least over the Scientist Glove. This one requires 45 unarmed, again another weird stat. This one requires 3 strength. It's actually the highest strength requirement out of any of these gloves, which is strange. 3 strength is fine though, you're probably going to have that on an unarmed character. This one does 34 damage per hit, so it is quite a bit better. 46 damage per second, which is also better. Has 5 crit damage on it, so that's not way great. Has a 3x crit modifier though, which is actually pretty good. That is substantial, and crits on this one do work a little bit differently with its effect. This only costs 18 action points, so it is far better in VATS than the other Scientist Gloves. Weighs 4 weight, has 100 item health, which is okay for item health. This also has multiple effects on it too, where once you hit an enemy, this actually makes it so it reduces their energy weapons by 5 for 30 seconds. That doesn't usually matter against most enemies, but it can be useful against some of the robots, so that's kind of something. This also reduces their strength by 2 for 30 seconds, which is, I guess, okay against melee enemies to where they won't hit you as hard. And then on the crit effect, once you punch something and you get a crit, it also reduces their strength by an additional 1, so reduce their strength by 3, which again can be useful against melee enemies, and it also reduces their damage threshold by 1 for 60 seconds, so they effectively lose 1 armor on them, which is okay against light armored enemies or clothing enemies where they only have like 2 defense on them. Dr. Klein's Glove is quite a bit better than the other gloves that we've talked about so far. It's still not an amazing glove by any means, it's still not going to outcompete others, but it is very unique, and if you want something that just has a bunch of effects on it, this one is okay, and I would say that it's very low B tier, maybe high C tier. I usually don't go for this one out of the gloves, but it is an option if you want to take it, and it's a really early game option, so if you want to rush right to Old World Blues, you can grab this one right away, and on an unarmed build, this one can be pretty good, especially if you just plan on using this up to the point where you can either get the next glove, which is Mobius's glove, or until you can get the Saturnite Fist Superheated, which is going to be one of the best unarmed weapons in the game. So it does kind of have a place there. And then our very last glove is Dr. Mobius's glove, which is by far the best glove because it belongs to Dr. Mobius of all characters, and he's one of my favorite characters in the entire game. You find this in the Forbidden Zone with Dr. Mobius, so you're going to get this at the very end of the main quest DLC. And this one requires 35 unarmed, again another weird stat, 2 strength to wield it. This one does 28 damage on hit, which is 38 damage per second, which is also okay. This one also does 5 crit damage, so still very low crit damage. Has a 2x crit modifier, so higher chance of hitting crits, which can be useful because this one also has effects similar to Klein's Glove. This one only requires 15 action points, making it actually quite good in a VATS build. Weighs 3 weight, has 100 item health, which is okay, and then it has multiple effects when you hit enemies. So if you hit an enemy, and this isn't a crit, then this reduces their energy weapons by 5 for 30 seconds, and it also reduces their perception by 2 for 30 seconds, which I guess would also help with energy weapons. So that's kind of useful. The main advantage this one has though is when you hit crits with it, because that has 2 additional effects on top of it, where it can knock back enemies, which can be pretty good in certain situations, especially against melee enemies, and it can also cause frenzy. If you hit an enemy and they frenzy, they will go and attack other nearby enemies, which is actually kind of useful. That's decent enough. That actually makes this a very unique weapon, and it's not a bad weapon to be carrying around if you want to take it for an unarmed build just for that reason. For a rating for Dr. Mobius's glove, I would actually put this right into B tier. I think it's good enough to be there because it is unique. Again, you can kind of rush it if you want to go to the DLC early. It's not going to be like my go-to unarmed weapon, at least for actually killing stuff. I'll take something like the Fist of Ra or the superheated Saturnite Fist for that. But still, it has its own place and it can be pretty good. And that includes all of the Scientist Gloves. We have quite a lot of them to look at, but some of these are pretty decent. Mobius's glove is pretty good. Klein's glove can be good if you're rushing Old World Blues. The rest aren't really worth taking. I mean, it's kind of cool that one of them is affected by Pyromaniac, but again, you have better unarmed in that DLC. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the Mantis Gauntlet and its unique variant. A very strange weapon that is pretty much just unique to New Vegas. I don't know of any of the other Fallout games that have at least a weapon quite like this. There are some other ones that have like the Deathclaw Gauntlet, which are at least kind of similar, and even New Vegas has that, as well as the Yao Gui Gauntlet. But this is a little bit different to have the actual Mantis Blade Gauntlet. So this is going to be kind of a rare weapon to find in New Vegas. Not a whole lot of vendors actually sell this. You can find it on a couple of them. Sometimes you can buy this from like Mick and Ralph's. The unique one you actually buy from Mick and Ralph as well, so that's kind of cool. You can buy it from a couple other places. You might see a few enemies actually carrying this around. You're more likely to find this in a DLC like Zion, though, where the White Legs might actually be carrying Mantis gauntlets around, and they also like to put Venom on their gauntlets, which is kind of nasty. So this isn't a super common weapon to find, but it is definitely a very unique one. The Mantis Gauntlet requires 75 unarmed and 4 strength to wield. 75 unarmed is pretty high, but if you're doing an unarmed build, you're probably going to have a lot. 4 strength is super easy to get, and I think every unarmed build is going to go with at least 4 strength, if not more than 4 strength, probably up to like 7 or 8 strength. Well, all you technically need is 7 to get to 10, but regardless, pretty achievable to get. The Mantis Gauntlet does 30 damage per hit, which is pretty decent. This also does 61 damage per second. It doesn't attack the fastest out of the melee or unarmed weapons, but it attacks fairly quick, so that's pretty nice. This one does 30 crit damage, so same as regular damage. One thing that separates the Mantis Gauntlet from other unarmed, though, is that this has a 3 times crit modifier, which is really high. That's really good. So if you have high luck, you're more likely to hit crits with this. That's fantastic. Only costs 22 action points to use, making it really good in a VATS build. This does weigh 10, surprisingly. It's actually very heavy, but it's heavy enough to actually count towards heavyweight too, which is weird. Most unarmed weapons don't count that high, and it actually makes it go down to a pretty reasonable weight at 5. And this one has 50 item health. The item health of the Mantis Gauntlet is pretty low, and it can break fairly fast. I guess that kind of makes sense. I do wish that this weapon was a fashionable weapon, like you could fashion it yourself, to where you could actually get Mantis forelimbs, and after you've collected so many of them, or maybe only giant Mantis forelimbs, or I guess just any of the full-grown Mantises, you could make your own gauntlet out of this. But sadly, you can't do that, and you do need to find other Mantis Gauntlets to fix this, or you're going to need weapon repair kits or something like jury rigging, which will make the health not really that much of an issue for this weapon. For the pros of the Mantis Gauntlet, this one does actually do pretty good damage and pretty good damage per second. It also has great crits, so hitting crits is pretty good with this. It feels pretty nice to use this overall. It's a pretty decent unarmed weapon towards the mid and end game. If you can get one early on, that's even better. The cons to this weapon are that this weapon is heavy. It weighs 10, or the unique one weighs 12. So this is actually pretty heavy, but heavyweight does actually cut that in half, so it could go down to 5 or 6 weight, which isn't too bad. It has low item HP, but again, if you have weapon repair kits or jury rigging, that's not necessarily an issue. And this is pretty rare. You're not going to find these just on regular random people in the Mojave. They just don't have them unless you have mods installed, which give enemies more weapon variety. But yeah, these ones are extremely rare. I think the only enemies that I at least can recall using them are like the White Legs in Zion, so you can take them off of them, but you're going to have to be at a certain level to get those too, which I think is level 20 or 30 to when they start spawning with those weapons, since those are considered like end game unarmed weapons. So it does have some downsides to it. There are also quite a lot of perks that can help with this. Basically all of them that are really good for unarmed and melee are really good for this one. It doesn't have any specific perk to it, but heavyweight can help. It cuts its weight in half. We've already talked about that. Piercing Strike is fantastic because it just gives you armor piercing, which is pretty fitting for the Mantis Gauntlet. The Mantises themselves, I believe, have armor piercing or armor negation similar to the Deathclaws, but I don't think the Mantis Glove actually has that by default, so Piercing Strike is pretty nice. If I'm incorrect about that, then Piercing Strike is less useful for this one. It would still be good for an unarmed or a melee build, but it wouldn't really help this one at all, because since it already punches through armor if that's the case. Slayer's fantastic because it gets you faster attack speed, so that's always good for any sort of melee or unarmed weapon. Super Slam's fantastic because you can knock enemies down, and if they're knocked down, it's really easy to punch them while they're on the ground. And then Purifier's great because it makes it so you get more damage towards abominations, and if you're going with an unarmed or melee build, that just means you're going to get more damage towards big things like super mutants and Deathclaws, so fantastic. Overall, the Mantis Gauntlet, I think I'm going to put into like the high B tier. I think it's a pretty solid weapon overall. It's not necessarily one of my go-to melee or unarmed weapons, because by the time I'm getting it, you honestly have just about everything that you could have unlocked. Whether you're going for a very specific melee or unarmed weapon, like a unique version of it, something like Knock Knock or something like that, or you could just have something that's generic and strong, like a Ballistic Fist. So this one I don't find myself using all that much, but it is definitely a cool and unique weapon, and I don't think it's bad at all. It's just it comes at kind of an awkward time in the game. We also need to talk about the unique version of the Mantis Gauntlet too. This is called Embrace the Mantis King, and this one is pretty cool. This one is added with the Gunrunner's Arsenal DLC, so you do need to have that. You need to buy this from Mick and Ralph, which is kind of unique. They actually sell two unique weapons, this one and Little Devil, which we haven't actually talked about Little Devil in a video like this. But Embrace the Mantis King is one of those weapons that you can buy. Since it is a buyable weapon and a named weapon, that does mean that it's going to be expensive, but it's not necessarily the most expensive thing. This is going to cost you about 10 to 12,000 caps. Still pricey, much pricier than a normal weapon, but maybe not a huge investment compared to some of them like Two Step Goodbye, which is easily like double or maybe even triple. I think it's double this price. So it's not the most expensive thing in the game, but it is kind of expensive. This one does look a little bit different than the regular Mantis Glove, and it does actually have some more bonuses to it than the regular Mantis Glove does too. So this one also requires 75 unarmed and 4 strength to wield. Not such a big deal there. This one has 42 damage on it, which is pretty good. That's more than the regular one. Only 66 damage per second. The Embrace the Mantis King actually attacks a little bit slower than regular Mantis Gauntlets do. It's not noticeably slower, but it is a little bit slower in terms of DPS, so you're not going to be doing as much with it as the regular one, at least if you need to hit something multiple times or hitting multiple enemies in quick succession. There is something that is very different about this though, and that is that its crit damage is much higher than its regular damage, which is pretty awesome. If you hit a crit with the Embrace the Mantis King, this deals 64 damage on hit. That is very high. That's almost as high as like a brush gun hitting them. So that's pretty nice. This still keeps its 3 times crit modifier too, so hitting those crits is pretty easy, and that makes it so your damage and damage per second will jump up quite a bit when you are hitting those crits. This one does cost a little bit more action points at 25, which is still good for a VATS build, but I don't know why it's higher than the regular Mantis Gauntlet. This one does weigh more than a regular Mantis Gauntlet at 12, so you can cut it in half by heavyweight and go down to 6. And this one does have more item HP, but it still doesn't have a whole lot of item HP. It has 80 item HP, which is, I think, the same as the Power Fist. So it's going to break as fast as that, which is still kind of fast, but at least it's not as quick as the 50 health that the regular Mantis Gauntlet has. This one, you could argue, is one of the most underrated weapons in all of Fallout New Vegas. A part of that might just be because not a whole lot of people realize it exists, and you have to go to Mick and Ralph to buy it. I think you also need to have their secret shop opened up, which requires like a 40 guns check, I think, or maybe it's a 30 guns check. Either way, that does grant you access to more weapons that they can be selling, so that's pretty cool. And if you want to use this one, it's actually a pretty solid overall unarmed weapon. I would put Embrace the Mantis King all the way up into A tier. I think it's really good. The only thing kind of holding it back are like its weight is kind of awkward, unless you're running heavyweight, and then it's not so much. Even then, you could argue that it's not really that big of a deal because unarmed doesn't really need to be carrying around a whole lot of weight, even on hardcore, since you're not carrying around bullets if you're going with it exclusively unarmed build, and its item health is a little bit low, but again, you could argue that away too if you have like jury rigging or weapon repair kits, in which case it's not that big of a deal. Both these are really good weapons. They're pretty solid overall unarmed weapons. I wouldn't necessarily consider them the strongest, but they are pretty high up there. They're like Embrace the Mantis King is definitely in the top 10 of unarmed weapons. Today we're going to be taking a look at 3 different claws that you can get throughout New Vegas. So these are the various gauntlets that you can get based on different animals throughout the wasteland. All 3 of these are actually DLC, but they are in different DLCs. So we've got the Yao Gui Gauntlet, which is based off of the Yao Guis, the giant bears that are around New Vegas. These were once black bears that have been changed and mutated thanks to all the years of radiation and everything. And then we also have the Fist of Rar, which is the Deathclaw Gauntlet. It is the only version of the Deathclaw Gauntlet since there was never a regular version in New Vegas. So let's start out with the Yao Gui Gauntlet. The Yao Gui Gauntlet and the unique version She's Embrace can be found in Zion in the Honest Hearts DLC. You can actually find quite a few of the regular Yao Gui Gauntlets because that is what the Sorrows have as their signature weapon. So if you see a dead Sorrow, you can pick this up off of their body. If you kill a Sorrow, you could take it. I guess you could also reverse pickpocket this if you had a different melee or unarmed weapon that they would switch to, or even potentially a gun that they might switch to. The Yao Gui Gauntlet requires 50 unarmed and 4 strength in order to wield, so actually not very high strength and not a whole lot of unarmed. If you're going into Zion at a fairly low to medium level, but you're going with an unarmed build, this should be something that you can use pretty early on. This does 20 damage per hit, which is okay. It's not the highest amount of damage. 33 damage per second, which is also okay. This doesn't attack the fastest out of any of the unarmed attacks, but it's okay enough. Does 30 crit damage, so more damage with crits than its regular damage, which is a little bit unique. Most weapons just do the same damage as their crit damage, so you get even more whenever you hit crits, which is pretty awesome. This has a 2.5 times crit modifier on it, so you're more likely to hit crits than quite a few other weapons. That's really good. This only costs 22 action points to use in VATS, which isn't very high for an unarmed weapon. So the Yao Gui Gauntlet can be a pretty good option there. This does weigh 10. It is one of the heaviest unarmed weapons in the game. This is actually heavy enough to get cut in half with heavyweight, which is pretty cool. We'll talk about that once we get to perks that affect these. And then this one has a massive 600 item health on it, as well as this weapon and all the weapons we're going to talk about do have the unique effect of ignoring damage threshold and ignoring damage resist. So it doesn't matter whether the enemy is wearing power armor or wearing no armor, you're going to be doing the same amount of damage to them, which makes it so the Yao Gui Gauntlet is very consistent. For the general pros of these weapons, they do have pretty good damage per second. All of these weapons are pretty good. They gradually get better as we go from one to the next. They all have good AP costs as well. They're all really good in a VATS build, and Unarmed really does like VATS, so that's pretty nice. And they do have really high item HP, at least with the Yao Gui Gauntlets. The Deathclaw Gauntlet, not as much, but the Yao Gui Gauntlet, 600 HP takes forever to break this, so it can be really, really nice if you just want to be taking this around, especially if you just want to clear up smaller enemies and you don't want to be breaking your good unarmed weapons on something. For the general cons though, the Deathclaw Gauntlet itself does have low item HP, so that only applies to that one, and these are all very heavy. They're all 10 weight, so heavy weight could cut it in half. You may not even worry about weight though with an unarmed and a melee build, since you don't need to have multiple of these around, and you don't need to be carrying around ammunition if you're playing on the hardcore difficulty. So it does have that kind of going for it. I guess the other sort of con for the Yao Gui Gauntlet, at least for a lot of people, is that they don't really like the way that it looks or how much screen it takes up, because it does actually take up quite a bit of your screen, especially when you're blocking. It does make it so a good maybe third of your screen you can't see where enemies are, and there can be enemies hiding behind that. So that can be a little bit frustrating. There are quite a few different perks that can help out with these as well. We've got Slayer, which makes it so you can attack faster with all of these. Very good. Super Slam to knock down enemies. Also very strong. Purifier to kill certain things like Deathclaws and other mutated enemies like Super Mutants. And normally Piercing Strike would also help unarmed and melee weapons, but since these already ignore all of the damage threshold and damage resist, it doesn't really matter if you have Piercing Strike or not. Piercing Strike is still a fantastic perk, and I would highly recommend it if you're going to be running an unarmed or a melee build, unless you're just specifically going to be using one of these weapons that completely ignores that aspect of melee and unarmed. For a rating on my tier list, I think I'd put the Yao Gui Gauntlet probably somewhere in the B tier. It's pretty decent overall. I don't always use it for everything, but it does do good damage. Ignoring damage threshold is nice, and being practically unbreakable also helps us out a lot. It's really surprising this thing has 600 item HP. That's the same amount of item HP as something like this machine, which has a ton of item health for a gun. This has just as much, but for an unarmed weapon, which is pretty awesome. The next gauntlet we're going to talk about is She's Embrace. This is the unique Yao Gui Gauntlet. You get this from completing a quest. This is a quest that you do for the Sorrows, the one where it's take drugs, kill a bear, and this is a giant flaming bear, and it is even scarier than the other Yao Guis. It does even more damage, and once you've hurt it so much, then it also splits into multiple bears, at least inside of your vision. Once you do kill this, then you can take She's Paw, and then you take that back to the shaman, and he will give you She's Embrace. She's Embrace is even better than a regular Yao Gui Gauntlet, where this one also requires 50 unarmed and 4 strength to wield. This one does 25 damage on hit, which is okay, 44 damage per second, which is also okay, nothing way crazy there for an unarmed or a melee weapon. Does 37 crit damage, kind of a weird amount, but it's cool that it has extra crit damage. Has a 3 times crit modifier, so you're really likely to hit crits with this, which is really good. This one only costs 20 action points, so it's even better in a VATS build. This one still weighs 10, and instead of having the massive 600 item health that the regular Yao Gui Gauntlet has, this one has an even higher 900 item HP. That makes it so Sheath's Embrace is practically unbreakable or not going to break anytime soon. Even if you want to use it as your main weapon throughout New Vegas, it's going to take you a very, very long time in order for you to break Sheath's Embrace. This one doesn't really look any different than the regular Yao Gui Gauntlet either. I kind of wish that was something. Maybe every once in a while it'd catch fire or you'd see hallucinations or something. But unfortunately, that's not the case. For Sheath's Embrace, I would say that this one is still probably like a B tier for me, but it's very high up into B tier, maybe into A tier. It's a very solid all-around weapon that can kind of do just about whatever you'd want for an unarmed build, but doesn't really feel overpowered, at least compared to some of the other unarmed weapons that we've talked about and will talk about in the future. And then our very last weapon that we need to talk about is called the Fist of Rar. This is the unique Deathclaw Gauntlet, or I guess it's the only Deathclaw Gauntlet, where this one can be found in the Divide. This is in the Lonesome Road. You do have to kill Rar in order to get it. He is a unique Deathclaw that has an extremely high amount of HP. He's very tanky. He can deal really high damage to you, but once you kill him, then you can search his body and you can take his hand. Now, there is something that's very unique about this, and that is that Rar's hand is considered a quest item. So if you take this to the Sierra Madre, it actually won't steal it from you because it's considered a quest item, which is really awesome. That means that you can smuggle the Fist of Rar into actually dead money, and then it becomes the most powerful weapon in that DLC. This can also be affected by the Wild Wasteland trait as well, where if you have that trait, then this is no longer the Fist of Rar, it's the Fist of the North Rar, which is a reference to the old 80s anime Fist of the North Star, which is an insanely violent anime. I would highly recommend it if you're into that sort of thing, and if you want like a 80s sci-fi Mad Max mixed with like a martial arts movie. It's very strange, very unique, but also really cool. The Fist of Rar requires 100 unarmed in order to wield, 6 strength in order to wield it as well, so fairly high, at least compared to the other weapons we've talked about. This one does 50 damage on hit, which is pretty good, 98 damage per second, which is also quite nice. This also has a massive 75 damage on crit, which is very high. That's actually one of the highest crits in the entire game. Has a 2x crit modifier, so you are more likely to hit crits. This costs 24 action points in order to use, so not very high, and it works quite well in a VATS build. Still weighs 10 like the other weapons we've talked about, and this one, instead of having that massive 900 item HP, this one only has 90, which is more normal for most unarmed weapons. This one can break somewhat quick, but you can kill things incredibly fast with this. I think this is one of the best unarmed weapons in the entire game. It's one of my go-tos if I'm going with an unarmed build. It looks really cool, it functions really well, does really high damage per second. The Fist of Rar, or the Fist of the North Rar, is going right up into the S tier for an unarmed weapon. I think it is very, very good. Today we're going to be taking a look at some kind of interesting weapons. This is going to be the Bladed Gauntlet and the Cram Opener, the unique version of the Bladed Gauntlet, which are two potential early to mid-game weapons that you can get. You can actually get a Bladed Gauntlet very early on if you want to run to like the Powder Ganger's prison, because there is always one guaranteed in the safe in there, so you can grab a Bladed Gauntlet that way. You can also get the Cram Opener without having to kill the NPC that actually has it, because he can die in other ways. So the Bladed Gauntlet requires 25 unarmed and 5 strength to wield. Fairly average strength and okay unarmed. If you want to run and get this early on and you're running an unarmed character, you're probably going to have high strength regardless, since it benefits unarmed. The Bladed Gauntlet will do 25 damage on hit, 39 damage per second, which are both okay in the early game. It's not one of the craziest amounts of damage or damage per second, but still decent. This one does 40 crit damage. Weirdly enough, this one has higher crit damage than it does regular damage, which is good. This one has a 2x crit modifier, which makes it so this one's actually pretty decent early on if you want to grab it for an unarmed build, because you can at least get a decent amount of crits with this. This one costs 26 action points, which is okay for an unarmed weapon. This one does weigh a lot at 10 weight. It's one of the heaviest unarmed weapons in the game. I think it's actually tied with the heaviest. I think it's this and like the Industrial Hand, and maybe there's one or two others that weigh 10. Oh wait, no, the Embrace the Mantis King has actually the heaviest, I think, at like 12. So the Bladed Gauntlet is one of the few unarmed weapons that can actually make use of the heavyweight perk, which is kind of useful. This one only has 60 item HP, which does make it so that this one breaks pretty quick, making it so that if you do get the Bladed Gauntlet in the early game, it can still be a little bit awkward because you might want to save it for particular enemy types. For the general pros of the Bladed Gauntlet, this one is available in the early game, so that is pretty nice, and it does have good crits, so it can actually rack up a decent amount of damage if you want to take this on an unarmed build. There is still some better options than this if you know where to go and you want to get them, especially if you want to go grab Chance's knife, since a lot of unarmed builds also are melee builds. and that would be the best early game option. But the Bladed Gauntlet is not a terrible early game option, but it's not a weapon I really see a whole lot of people talk about because they are kind of rare too. For the cons, this one does have low item HP. Both the unique version and this version break fairly fast, so you probably don't want to be using them too much. If you have weapon repair kits, you can kind of get around this, or once you get jury rigging, it becomes a lot easier to fix these up, and then the low item HP doesn't matter. These also fall off later compared to other unarmed and melee weapons. They're okay in the early game. Again, if you're just playing through the game normally, they're a decent option then. They're going to be better than a lot of other early game weapons that we have talked about, like the machete. Potentially they're better than Brass Knuckles, although Brass Knuckles will go a lot further than this. There is also quite a few perks that can help out these. Heavyweight does help these out because it cuts them in half, so they go from 10 weight to 5 weight, which is kind of cool. Purifier to kill certain enemies like Deathclaws and Super Mutants, which can be good on any unarmed and melee build. It's Piercing Strike so that you can punch through armor. That's really nice. Super Slam so you can knock enemies down. If you knock them down, you can beat them up really easy. And then Slayer to attack faster. All really good staples for an unarmed or melee build. This one doesn't really have any unique perks to it, similar to like Pyromaniac like we talked about with the Superheated Saturnite Fist. So the Bladed Gauntlet, I think I'm going to put this one into like C tier on my tier list. I think it's fine enough. I honestly don't use this that much. When I do use it, it feels pretty decent, but it does break fairly fast. So even on like my unarmed character builds, I usually don't go for this, especially since you can go and get Love and Hate right away if you know where to go. And that one is kind of like my default early game to mid game weapon for an unarmed weapon. So I think it's better than the Bladed Gauntlet, but the Bladed Gauntlet is still pretty decent overall for what you would kind of want it for. Let's move over to the unique version, which is called the Cram Opener. So this one is found on Little Buster. He is a unique NPC that is found at Camp McCarran. He is hunting down the fiends, which if you kill the fiends and then talk to him about it, he will just disappear from Camp McCarran, and then his body will show up later in Freeside. So then you can take the Cram Opener off of him. You could also reverse pickpocket him and get this off of him, or just kill him and take it off of him. Those are all options too. This one requires 25 unarmed and 5 strength, same as the regular Bladed Gauntlet. This one does 28 damage per hit, 48 damage per second, so it is a bit better, but about the same attack speed as the regular Bladed Gauntlet. This one does 44 crit damage, again, higher than its regular damage and kind of a weird amount of crit damage. This one also has a 2x crit modifier, also costs 26 action points, also weighs 10, and this one has slightly better item health at 75, so it still breaks fairly fast. It's still not that great for an unarmed weapon. I don't think that this one is really worth going out of your way to get, but since you don't really need to kill the NPC, or you don't really need to reverse pickpocket him, the Cram Opener is a little bit more useful than some other weapons like the Big Boomer or like Corporal Sterling's lever action rifle, where if you don't want to kill those NPCs, you're going to spend quite a while reverse pickpocketing them, because for some odd reason they're both very difficult to reverse pickpocket if you don't have high sneak and a stealth boy. Like the time you're getting to like New Vegas, you probably already have some decent unarmed weapons, and you can get some other decent unarmed weapons from there. Especially if you want to buy some from the Gunrunners, or if you already have grabbed like Love and Hate, or if you want to grab like Pushy. So this one I think is better than the Bladed Gauntlet, but I still think I'm going to put this one into like C tier. I don't use it very often. It's okay when I do use it. It doesn't feel bad or anything, but it's not really one of my favorite unarmed weapons. So that'll do it for the Bladed Gauntlet and its unique variant. Tell me your thoughts on the Bladed Gauntlet and the Cram Opener down in the comments below. I do at least like the name of the Cram Opener since it refers to the cram that you can eat in the game. Maybe it should also come with a bonus of giving you like double item HP or something whenever you are eating those. That would be kind of a fun little bonus to it. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Bear Trap Fist, as well as we're going to be taking a look at another fist weapon, the Dog Tag Fist, because these ones are kind of their own unique weapon, and they sort of go together, even though they're not related at all. So this is just kind of the only place that this would fit. Let's talk about the Bear Trap Fist first. This is probably the strongest weapon that you can get in the Dead Money DLC, weirdly enough. Assuming that you're just going to Dead Money and only using this in Dead Money, it's actually really, really strong within that DLC. It has some issues outside of the DLCs. Let's go over the stats of the Bear Trap Fist and talk about why it's so strong in Dead Money. So the Bear Trap Fist requires 50 unarmed and 5 strength in order to wield. Not too much unarmed, not too much strength. You'll be able to do this with an unarmed character without too much trouble, especially even if you're running to Dead Money right away. You should be able to get 50 unarmed pretty quick. This one does 27 damage per hit, 30 damage per second. This one doesn't attack super fast, but it's okay, and it doesn't do high damage, but it's also alright. This one also has 27 crit damage, same as its regular damage. 1 times crit modifier, so normal crits. Costs 28 action points, which makes it so it's okay. It's not one of the best unarmed weapons, although it is really good to be using in VATS in dead money. This one weighs quite a lot for an unarmed weapon at 6 weight. Kind of makes sense since it is a bear trap that you just got roped around your arm. This one has 80 health, so not the highest, and this one has the unique effect of doing 2 times limb damage. That is a very important part for why this is so strong in dead money, because when you're fighting the ghost people, the only way you can permanently kill the ghost people is by ripping their limbs off. If you can't do that, then they aren't going to die permanently, which is kind of an issue. And if you do rip off limbs, it doesn't matter how much health that they currently have. If you tear the limb off, then you will kill them outright, which is really strong, especially for a weapon that does extra limb damage. On top of that, if you have high unarmed, you get access to other attacks inside of VATS, making it so the Bear Trap Fist in VATS, in dead money, is the strongest weapon in that DLC because you can kill the ghost people the most effective, and that's the main enemy that you're going to be fighting. Since aside from that, you're just going to have like rad roaches, which you can kill with anything, that doesn't really matter, and the radios to deal with, which, I mean, the police pistol will work just fine for that. However, once you get out of the DLC, then the Bear Trap Fist kind of just has regular stats, and it's less useful because instead of just tearing limbs off, you'll just cripple limbs easier than you already would. Which is still good, but it's not as good as just outright killing an enemy. For the pros of these weapons, this one does do extra limb damage. The Dog Tag Fist don't have this, but the Bear Trap Fist does, so that is really, really good for that specific role. It's also potentially a really strong early game weapon if you want to rush dead money. Dead money is one of the more difficult DLCs to do, but if you can do it, Bear Trap Fist is okay at that, and it can work fairly well once you get back to the Wasteland. For the major cons of this, though, is that it does have low item HP. This one only has 80. The other Dog Tag Fists don't have a whole lot either, but they're better than the Bear Trap Fist. 80 health does make it so this can break fairly fast, and it has lowish stats all the way around, so it's going to fall off pretty hard once you get back to the Wasteland and once you can use other weapons. There is technically one other weapon that's stronger in dead money than the Bear Trap Fist, but that is the Fist of Rar, and you have to go out of your way to get that, and you wouldn't really know that unless you already knew it ahead of time, or you probably looked it up, where if you kill Rar and you take his hand and you take it to dead money, you can just make it there on a workbench, and then you have like one of the strongest unarmed weapons in the entire game that's already in a DLC where things have been toned heavily towards unarmed and melee to where they are much stronger. There are also quite a few perks that help out with these weapons. The usual type of perks. There's no individual perk that will buff these weapons, but Slayer is really good for increased attack speed, Piercing Strike so that you can punch through armor, Super Slam to knock down enemies is really nice, and Purifier to kill all the abominations. All of those are really good to have. For an overall rating for the Bear Trap Fist, I think I'd probably put this one into C tier on my tier list. It's okay enough. It's not really crazy. It would be S tier in dead money specifically, but outside of dead money, not so much. It's just not one of the best, so I think C tier overall is fine. There is technically a modified version of the Bear Trap Fist, but it doesn't change it that much. You can get one mod for this, and that is upgraded springs, so you get 3 more points of damage, which 3 more points of base damage does take you up to 30 damage, which is okay for an unarmed weapon, but it's still not a massive amount. So I'm not going to put up a new graphic on here because I think it would still be C tier. It's a little bit better than the Bear Trap Fist. It is better in the DLC, and importantly, you do need to get that upgrade while you're in the DLC. Not specifically buy it in the DLC, but you do need to unlock the blueprint for it while you're in the DLC, because otherwise you can't get it once you go back to the Wasteland. So that is an important thing. You have to do that. That's the same thing with all of the dead money items. If you need to get them there, you got to get them there, and if you need to get them upgraded, you also need to get them upgraded there, or at least get the upgrades there so you can buy them once you get back to the Wasteland. Now let's move on to the Dog Tag Fist, which is kind of a cool unarmed weapon. This one is a made weapon. You actually have to make this on a workbench, interestingly enough, so you need to get the schematic, and you will need to do an unmarked quest in order to get this. This one is going to the Camp Guardian Caves and helping out the private there. He will then give you this at the end of that quest, which is kind of high leveled because you will have to be fighting the Lake Larks, or you're more than likely going to be fighting the Lake Larks. So it's not really a great prize for what you get. You can then make this out of NCR dog tags. Just looking at them, it just looks like it'd be so easy to break your fingers punching stuff with those, so I wouldn't really recommend it if you're going to do that in real life, but I mean, it is kind of a cool concept in the game. So the Dog Tag Fist requires 0 unarmed and 1 strength to wield, meaning any character can effectively wield these. This does 20 damage on hit, which is okay, 32 damage per second. These do actually punch fairly fast, so that's good. 20 crit damage, which is normal, 1 times crit modifier, normal crits. Costs 35 action points, so kind of high on the action points. I don't know why for these ones, but it is. This one weighs 3, which is a little bit heavier than what you kind of think it would be, but alright. And then this one has 100 item health. So these ones can break kind of quick. They're an okay unarmed weapon overall. There's nothing way crazy about them. I don't know of anybody that really is going to be using the Dog Tag Fist because it's kind of a way to go to get this, and it's going to be kind of difficult. It would be much easier if you just went like right north of Good Springs and got Love and Hate. I feel like that would be just as difficult, but Love and Hate is a much better option than the Dog Tag Fists. I don't really see a point in doing this. They are kind of cool thematically though. I would also probably put the Dog Tag Fist into the low end of C tier. I don't think it's a crazy weapon in any way. I don't think it's a terrible weapon though either. I would say it's kind of bordering on D tier, but it still at least attacks fairly fast, and if you have all the unarmed perks, it's still going to feel pretty good, just like a lot of melee and unarmed weapons, so it has that going for it. There is a unique version of this too though, and that is called the Recompensance of the Fallen, and this one's actually much easier to get than the regular Dog Tag Fist, so I'd recommend you just go and get that one. You can get this one at Cottonwood Cove. This one's at the Legion camp, and this can be found in the desk of the officer there. You just have to steal it, and then you have it. So the Recompensance of the Fallen is actually pretty easy to get, since you're probably going to be going that way naturally through the map, so you can just run right over there and grab it. You can actually just ignore everything and run and grab it, and it could be your first unarmed weapon if you want, which makes it decent, especially since you don't need to fight anything. This one requires 0 unarmed and 1 strength to wield, same as the regular Dog Tag Fist. This one does 25 damage per hit, 48 damage per second, 25 crit damage, has a 1x crit modifier, so no more crits. Also costs 35 action points to use, also weighs 3 weight just like the regular Dog Tag Fist, but this one has 150 item health, so it has better item health overall. This one is just a straight upgrade to the Dog Tag Fist, but since the Dog Tag Fist is just kind of okay, this one is also just kind of okay. It's a little bit better. I would also probably move this one into the C tier on our tier list too. It's going to be higher up than the regular Dog Tag Fist. Arguably better or worse than the Bear Trap Fist that we've talked about. Maybe a little bit worse if you have the modded Bear Trap Fist, since that one's doing more damage per hit. But they're all kind of these okay weapons. These are all just sort of alright. Tell me your thoughts on these weapons, the Bear Trap Fist, the Dog Tag Fist, and its unique variants. Do you guys enjoy these? Do you guys use them? I think they're kind of cool thematically, and the Bear Trap Fist is really strong in dead money, but outside of that, I don't really use it, and I don't really use the Dog Tag Fist either at really any point. Today we're going to be talking about the Power Fist from New Vegas. This one has been a Fallout staple for as long as Fallout's been around. There's been a Power Fist in every single Fallout game, or at least some variation of a Power Fist in every single Fallout game too. So we're going to be talking about this today. And I'm not actually going to be including every single thing that is technically counted as a Power Fist or goes for a Power Fist, because this won't include the Saturnite Fist or the Saturnite Fist Superheated or the Industrial Hand, because I feel like all those weapons are kind of different enough from one another. It really wouldn't make the most sense to keep them on the same video list. So they're going to have their own separate videos. The Saturnite Fist is going to get one, and the Industrial Hand's going to get one. But we'll still be looking at the regular Power Fist, the modified version of it that you can get in the Gunner's Arsenal, and then the 2 unique versions of the Power Fist here. Otherwise, we're going to go up to 7 fists, and then we have to talk about all the other unique mechanics that go along with them. Anyway, the Power Fist is probably a weapon that you're going to be getting around the mid to late game for New Vegas. There are a couple places where you can just run and get one right away, so that does help, especially if you want to go and get some of the unique ones. Then you can do that as well, especially if you want to just run right to Old World Blues and you want to count the Saturnite Fist, then you can go and get that at any time. The Power Fist requires 50 unarmed and 5 strength to wield, so not very high strength and not very high unarmed. You're probably going to have a lot of strength if you're going with an unarmed build anyway, since unarmed and melee tend to like a lot of strength. 50 unarmed is totally doable by the time that you're going to be getting this. This does 40 damage per hit, which is pretty good. That's actually pretty nice damage per hit, although it only does 44 damage per second. The Power Fist does not attack super fast, and that can be a little bit annoying when you're first getting used to it, especially compared to some of the unarmed weapons that you had access to before, like the Spike Knuckles. So this might not actually feel like a super big upgrade over something like that. This does have 40 crit damage, which is good. This has a 1x crit chance, so pretty average. Only costs 28 action points, which isn't super high. It's higher than other things like we've talked about with the Spike Knuckles. And for the most part, I think Spike Knuckles are actually kind of an improvement over the Power Fist by the time you're getting it, but the unique versions and some of the modded versions can help out with this. This weighs 6 weight, so it's fairly heavy for an unarmed weapon. Most unarmed weapons don't weigh very much. This is one of the heavier of them. And this has 80 item health, which is not the most amount of item health either, especially for a weapon like this where you're probably going to have to hit something multiple times. Against small and weak enemies, maybe not. You might just want to hit them once and kill them. And if you're using VATS attacks, that can help too, because Unarmed does get unique VATS attacks. They're always the same unique ones though, where you have like the uppercut and the cross hit. Those are usually better than regular hits in the VATS. Depends on what weapon you're using and what enemy you're attacking. but those ones generally are kind of the better options, but they're always the same. This isn't like how Melee has its own unique attacks and VATs. Power Fist might be kind of hard to buy early on too. You can buy them from like the Brotherhood, so if you want to run right there, you can. There's a couple other places you can buy them. I think the Gunrunners might sell them. I could be wrong, I've never bought a Power Fist from the Gunrunners. And there is also regular Power Fist as well as the Gunrunners Arsenal version of Power Fist, where the Gunrunners Arsenal version can be modded out, regular versions cannot, so you kind of want to go for them. And you can buy those ones early on because any vendor can sell them, since the Gunrunners Arsenal weapons kind of just pop in and out of inventories, or at least most vendors can sell them. Traveling merchants can sell them, so buying a Power Fist early on isn't that bad of an option, and you could potentially even mod it out pretty early on if they happen to have the parts for it. For the pros of the Power Fist, this one does do pretty good damage per hit. That is something that's nice, and it has pretty good action points, so using it in VATs is not the worst. It's not the best for an action point build, but it's not the worst either. The general cons of the Power Fist, though, is that it does have low item health. You might be breaking this kind of quick, which isn't a huge deal if you have something like jury rigging where you can fix it with any unarmed. So if you just find boxing tape or something, you can fix it up for nothing. And it is kind of slow as well. You don't attack super fast with the Power Fist, at least normally, and that can kind of cause issues because against other melee type enemies, they might be able to attack you really fast, hit you multiple times before you can hit them once or twice back in return. So you might just be losing the trade there unless you have certain other perks that can help out with that. I should mention too, the Power Fist and any of its variants also count as holdout weapons or improved holdout weapons, so you need to have 50 sneak in order to sneak these into areas. But they will be a pretty strong sneak-in weapon if you want to do that. For an overall rating for the Power Fist, I think I'd put it into like the B tier. It's decent enough. I'd put it kind of on the lower end of B tier though, because I honestly don't use regular Power Fists very often. By the time I'm getting them, I probably have like Love and Hate, which is a better weapon than this. And you could get like the Gunrunners Arsenal version, which can also be better, or the unique versions. So let's talk about the Gunrunners Arsenal version next, and the different mods that you can attach to it, because that does change up the weapon a decent amount. For mods for the Gunrunners Arsenal Power Fist, you can get 3 of these. You can buy them at basically any vendor. Any sort of traveling vendor might sell these. And you can get Chrome Tubes. This increases your overall item health by 100%, so you go from 80 health to 160 health. That does help quite a bit with the Power Fist since it doesn't have the most amount of health. You can get the high capacity valves. These ones give you plus 8 to your base damage, so you go from 40 base damage up to 48 base damage. That's pretty good. And you can also get the ported chambers. The ported chambers give you 20% increased attack speed. That one helps out the Power Fist quite a bit, since again, it doesn't attack super fast. This isn't going to make it so it attacks really quick, but it does make it feel a lot better than it used to. With all of these on here, it does make the Power Fist feel a little bit better, and I think I would still put this one up into B tier, but it's on the high end of B tier, whereas the other one is on the low end of B tier. It's still a pretty good weapon. It can still feel a little bit awkward, especially compared to other unarmed weapons that you can get around the same time that you're getting a Power Fist, or that you could have gotten even before this, again like the Spiked Knuckles, but still a pretty decent weapon overall that does well on an unarmed build. And then we also have the 2 unique versions of the Power Fist that we need to talk about too. So for the very first one, we're going to be talking about Salt Upon Wounds Power Fist. This one is a unique Power Fist that you get at the very end of Honest Hearts. After you've beaten Salt Upon Wounds in whatever way that you chose to beat him, you will be able to open up the locker at the end of this, and this is where you get like all of Daniel's, Joshua's, and Salt Upon Wounds gear. And the Salt Upon Wounds Power Fist is a little bit unique compared to other Power Fists. So this one also requires 50 unarmed, but this one requires 6 strength, weirdly enough, so it actually requires a little bit more. This one does 45 damage per hit, which is more than a Power Fist, plus it does an additional 3 damage for 10 seconds over time, since this one always deals damage over time to any sort of enemy that you're hitting. That can actually be kind of nice. It can make it so you can kill certain things over time, since you might just want to punch them once, and if they're low health, just leave them alone until they die from that. Anything else, you're just applying more stacks of damage over time to them, so that's good. For damage per second, this one does 62 damage per second, plus that 3 damage over 10 seconds, so the damage per second can actually be quite a bit higher, but this thing seems to attack at about the same speed as a regular Power Fist, but it has higher base damage. This does 45 crit damage on hit, which is fine, has a 1x crit modifier, also normal. This only costs 25 action points. It costs less than a regular Power Fist to use in VATs, so that's nice. This one also weighs 6 weight, and this one has 100 item health, so it has a little bit more than a Power Fist. This one is a perfectly fine weapon. I do like the look of it. It's pretty cool, but going all the way through a DLC just to get this one, I don't think it's really the best, and I would probably also put this one up in the high B tier. It's a good overall unarmed weapon, but it's not one of the strongest unarmed weapons, and it doesn't compare to some of the other ones that you could get from other DLC. Again, like other ones from other DLCs, like the Superheated Saturnite Fist is really good compared to this, and some other ones like the Fist of Ra would also go to a DLC to get, and that one's really, really strong too. This one's solid enough, but it's not what I would consider like a really top tier weapon. Then we also have one more Power Fist to talk about. This one's in the Gunrunner's Arsenal DLC. You do have to buy this one, and you have to buy this one from the Brotherhood. This one is called the Greased Lightning, and this one also requires 50 unarmed and 5 strength, same as a regular Power Fist to wield. This one actually does 32 damage per hit, less damage per hit than a regular Power Fist, but it does 96 damage per second. This one attacks way faster than a regular Power Fist, about 3 times as fast as a regular Power Fist would. So the attacks come really quick from this, and that helps it out a lot. This does 32 damage on crit, which is fine. It has a 1x crit modifier, costs 28 action points, weighs 6, all the same stats as a regular Power Fist, but it does have 200 item health, so it actually takes quite a while for this one to break, at least compared to the regular Power Fist. This is kind of on par with a lot of other unarmed weapons, so it can break kind of quick, but the damage per second that this one puts out is really good. This one is also very satisfying just to punch things super fast with. I really like Greased Lightning. You do have to buy this from the Brotherhood, like I said, and it does cost you quite a lot. If the Brotherhood's dead, then you can buy this from the Gunrunners, but you do have to kind of do at least part of the Brotherhood quest in order to get this, or go to the Brotherhood, kill them, and then go to the Gunrunners to buy this, so it's going to take some investment both in time and in money for you to get this one. Definitely worth it though. It's probably the strongest of the Power Fists, and I think I'd put Greased Lightning up into A tier. I don't know if I'd quite put it up into S tier. It feels really good, and it's probably one of my go-tos for unarmed weapons, but I don't think it's as strong as some of the other unarmed weapons that you get access to in the game. Things like the Fist of Rar and the superheated Saturnite Fist I think would be better than Greased Lightning, but this one is still competing with quite a few of them. There are some perks though that we should talk about for the Power Fist, and these ones are just generally good unarmed and melee perks. Super Slam is super useful because you can knock down enemies with the Power Fist, and if they're knocked down, they're easy to beat up on. That one's really nice. You can get Piercing Strike. Piercing Strike makes it so any of your attacks have armor piercing on them. That's really good, especially for an unarmed build that already does high damage. It's really good on Greased Lightning because you can just keep punching stuff, and most enemies don't have enough armor to actually just tank through the hits, so if you combine this like Super Slam, it does even more damage. You can have Purifier, which makes it so you have more damage towards mutated enemies like Super Mutants, Ghouls, and Deathclaws. Really good for an unarmed build. And you can also have Slayer, which increases your attack speed with all of these. That helps out the Power Fist quite a bit since it doesn't attack super fast, and it helps out Greased Lightning a lot because it already does attack really fast, so attacking even quicker is even nicer. You could also stack something like Rushing Water on top of this. That is a chem, so it's not really a perk. But if you stack that on there, then you get an even faster attack speed with it, and it makes it so at least Greased Lightning is a very competent weapon that you can use all throughout the game. Power Fist in general is a pretty decent weapon, although I don't think it's one of the strongest unarmed or melee weapons for most builds. Still a very fun one though, and definitely an iconic one of the Fallout series. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Saturnite Fist, the Saturnite Fist Superheated, and the Industrial Hand. These are the other half of the Power Fists that I didn't go over when I was going over the regular Power Fist because there's so many versions of them in this game. So let's talk about each of these. These can all be found in DLCs. 2 of them are in Old World Blues, and 1 of them is in the Lonesome Road. First up, we're going to be going over the Saturnite Fist, and we're going to be talking about that. We'll also kind of go over pros and cons at the same time with these weapons, but there will be different pros and cons for each of them. So the Saturnite Fist is a fairly common weapon that you can find in Old World Blues. You can find this inside of boxes. The lobotomites can carry these around. It's also a very good unarmed weapon that you can find in Old World Blues pretty easily, which makes it kind of strange that the Scientist Gloves are there, and this one is substantially better than them. So this one has the same attack set as the Power Fist, although it is a bit faster at attacking than the regular Power Fist, which is pretty nice. The Saturnite Fist requires 45 unarmed and 4 strength to wield. One of those weird numbers of unarmed to use. A lot of Old World Blues stuff has this for some odd reason, I don't know why. So the unarmed and the strength isn't very high, and if you're running an unarmed character, you can probably get one of these and use it right away, even at low levels, which is pretty nice. This does 35 damage per hit, which is fairly high for an unarmed weapon like this. This does 63 damage per second, which is quite good. This has 35 crit damage, same as its regular damage, 1x crit modifier, so normal crits. Weighs 4 weight in total, just like a regular Power Fist. Has 160 item health though, a lot more health than a regular Power Fist, which is pretty good. And this amount of item health does help it quite a bit, especially if you do want to run to Old World Blues right away. An unarmed build is actually quite strong. An unarmed build is actually quite strong in almost all of the DLCs if you want to run there. This also only costs 25 action points to use, which is pretty good. Not necessarily one of the lowest action point costs, but not super high either, so it works really well in a VATS build. For the general pros of this weapon, it is very easy to find. You can find it all over Old World Blues, even if you're just looking in boxes. You can find it everywhere, so that's really good. It has high damage and it has high damage per second, more so with the other versions we're going to talk about, at least the unique version of this, or modified version of it with the superheated version. The regular version's damage and damage per second is still pretty decent though, and this, at least with the superheated version, does have fire damage, which is a pretty big bonus. We can also kind of go over the Industrial Hand's pros and cons here as well, since we'll might as well talk about that one. It has also pretty good damage per second, okay damage per hit, and it ignores armor and damage threshold, which is a big selling point of it, so that is actually really good. For the major cons of this, the regular Saturnite Fist doesn't really have any cons for a unarmed weapon. Like, it's not very difficult to find, it doesn't break super fast, it's got decent damage per second. The only major con would just be that it gets outcompeted by some of the other unarmed weapons and melee weapons, but not by a substantial amount, so it's still a fairly solid weapon. Cons for the superheated one, you do have to make it, but that's not such a big deal, especially if you plan on 100%ing the game, you're going to be able to do that no problem then. The Industrial Hand, on the other hand, does have more cons though, where it is very, very awkward in VATS. Basically, you never want to use it in VATS. It has a really high action point cost, and you'd have to get through about half of Lonesome Road in order to get it, so all of those are a little bit wonky for it. So the cons here are a little bit weird. Let's also go over the perks, which are also going to seem a little bit strange that affect these weapons. There are some that affect all of them, so let's go over those ones first, and they're the regular melee and unarmed perks that work really well. So we've got Piercing Strike for punching through armor, really good, except for I guess the Industrial Hand, since this still works on it, but it already ignores the damage threshold, so you don't need to worry about that. Purifier, which makes so you do more damage towards mutated enemies like Deathclaw, super mutants, tunnelers, and stuff like that. All really high level enemies that are nice to kill. Slayer, which makes so you can attack faster. This, I think, still affects the Industrial Hand. I'm not entirely sure. I would assume that it does. And then Super Slam, which allows you to knock enemies on the ground. Now, there are some other perks that affect specific ones. Let's talk about those two, at least that I'm going to highlight here. We have Heavyweight, which affects the Industrial Hand. Since the Industrial Hand weighs 10, it can be cut in half down to 5, which is pretty nice. And then we also have Pyromaniac, which makes it so the superheated version of the Saturnite Fist gets even more damage per second and even more damage. Pyromaniac is the highest damage buffing perk in the game. It's just that it only affects a few weapons. The Saturnite Fist Superheated is one of those few weapons, so you actually get a lot of value out of Pyromaniac with this. For an overall rating for the regular Saturnite Fist, I would put this one up into A tier. I think it's solid all the way around. It works really well as an unarmed weapon, but there are some better unarmed weapons that do kind of outcompete it. I think it is just a straight upgrade to a Power Fist though, so that's really nice. Let's move over to the Saturnite Fist Superheated, and we'll talk about that one. This one requires 55 unarmed and 5 strength to wield. Weirdly enough, more strength. That's not usually super common with the unique versions of weapons, but in this case it is. You do have to make these. In order to make these, you do have to get one of the personality mods for the toaster, and then he will make these for you, and you can make an infinite amount of them, assuming that you have the regular fist. So this isn't a unique one-of-a-kind weapon, which does make it actually fairly easy to get, and if you do ever lose it, break it, or just misplace it, you can make another one. It's not a huge deal. This one does 55 damage per hit, 91 damage per second, 55 damage on crit hit. This one has a 1x crit modifier, weighs 4. This one has less item health at 120. This one also costs 25 action points, which can be pretty good. And when it hits crits, it deals 2 damage for 5 seconds with fire on enemies. This also, since it counts as a fire weapon, can be stacked with Pyromaniac, which makes it get a huge amount of damage, and that makes its damage per second go really high. This is probably one of the best unarmed weapons in the entire game because the damage and damage per second is really good. This does attack faster than a regular Power Fist. The extra fire damage on it is kind of nice, but not entirely necessary. The superheated version of this, I'm actually going to put all the way up in S tier. I think it's one of the best unarmed weapons in the game. Since the regular version is so good, and if you have Pyromaniac, this one is even better than it. Now let's move over to the Industrial Hand. Since this one is a completely different weapon and a little bit strange, this is a saw blade onto the fist, and you use it very similar to like the Ripper, the Chainsaw, or the Thermic Lance, and it has the same effect as any of those weapons, which I don't think we've talked about any of them so far in these videos. So we will have to do that in the future. These ones all ignore damage threshold, which is really useful, and damage resistance, so it doesn't matter if your enemy is wearing heavy armor or wearing no armor, it will hit all the same. That is a really big selling point of these weapons, as well as this weapon doesn't punch like a lot of other weapons. It does have the Power Fist animation for punching, but you just hold out your arm and use the saw blade to cut into enemies. This one I think has the shortest reach out of any of those weapons though. I think the Rippers might be the same reach as this or a little bit longer. The Chainsaw and the Thermic Lance have much longer reach than this, and I think are kind of better weapons for this same type of job, but let's go over the stats of this. The Industrial Hand requires 75 unarmed and 7 strength to wield, so fairly high, although it is found in the Lonesome Road, and that's generally like the end game DLC. You can find this right at the part where you're launching the nuke. This one does 50 damage on hit, 160 DPS because it is just like one of the Rippers. You just hold it onto something and you keep dealing damage per second. This has 40 crit damage, which is actually very high for a weapon like that, The Chainsaw, the Thermic Lance, and the Ripper all have very low crits. This one actually has pretty high crits on it. This one has a 1x crit modifier, which is also fairly good for a weapon that hits so often. This costs a massive 65 action points to use in VATS, and like I said earlier, you should never be using the Industrial Hand in VATS. It is very, very bad in VATS. This one weighs 10, so again, you can cut it in half with heavyweight and go down to 5. It is one of the heavier unarmed weapons, and this has 1600 item HP because it breaks so fast since it's hitting so often. So that kind of makes sense. This one I find to be kind of awkward and not as good as like the Thermic Lance or the Chainsaw for doing the same job. I think those are better options where the Chainsaw has more mods that you can put on it, and I think that makes it a bit better, and the Thermic Lance has better reach. The Thermic Lance also has a really good VATS attack. I think the Chainsaw does too. I think they both have Mauler, which is a really, really good VATS attack. The Industrial Hand doesn't really get anything like that, and you don't want to be using this in VATS because it is really janky, so it does make it just a weird choice overall for me. I think I'd put the Industrial Hand into B tier. It is a very strong unarmed weapon, but it's a very awkward unarmed weapon and not one that I find myself using very much. The superheated Saturnite Fist, though, is definitely an S tier and a really, really good weapon. So would I recommend these? Sure, they're all pretty good. Saturnite Fist is good, Superheat is really good, Industrial Hand is okay, but kind of quirky and a little bit weird. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Zap Glove and its unique variant, the Paladin Toaster. These are generally endgame unarmed weapons that you're going to be finding, or honestly even into the mid-game, since the Paladin Toaster is very easy to actually get since it's right next to Helios 1. The regular Zap Glove, though, I don't ever really see until I'm getting later on into the game. Like once I've joined the Brotherhood, sometimes you can buy them from them. I think like the Great Khans might sell these. There might be a couple other people that sell the Zap Glove. I'm not entirely sure who actually sells it. I'm usually not on the lookout for it since you can get the Paladin Toaster so easy. But the regular Zap Glove requires 75 unarmed and 4 strength in order to wield. So not the most unarmed and not the most strength, especially towards like the end of the game. You're going to definitely have that for an unarmed character. 4 strength is totally manageable. The regular Zap Glove does 35 damage on hit, which is okay. It's a little bit better than a Power Fist in that regard. 57 damage per second, which is perfectly fine too. This one does 35 crit damage, same as its regular damage, has a 1x crit modifier, costs 28 action points, weighs 6, has 100 item health, so the item health is kind of on the lower side. The rest of the stats are pretty standard for unarmed weapons at this point in the game. And this does have a unique effect. Since it is an electricity-based weapon, it does do extra damage towards robots and towards power armor. This is a plus 50 extra robot damage, at least in regular New Vegas. If you're in Old World Blues, it's going to be reduced damage, and the power armor damage is also reduced compared to the robot damage. This does make it so it can be an anti-robot weapon, which on its surface sounds good, but there's not a whole lot of enemies that are either wearing power armor or are robots, or situations where you're going to run into both of them pretty frequently. Robots are very limited in New Vegas overall, so the effectiveness of this weapon, at least in terms of its unique effect, isn't always the best. It also has a kind of blinding visual animation, or at least it's hard to see once you hit this because it electrocutes whatever you hit, and it kind of puts up a puff of smoke in front of you, so it's difficult to tell if you're still hitting the same enemy or if other enemies are attacking you. So that can be just a little bit of a downside for the Zap Glove in general. That probably won't affect it if you're playing in like third person, but in first person it is kind of distracting. For the major pros of the Zap Glove and its unique variant, the electricity damage is nice, the extra EMP damage towards robots and power armor is something, even though it may not be a major factor to it, and this has pretty good damage per second. Like a lot of the mid to end game unarmed weapons, the damage per second is pretty solid, even more so with perks, which we'll talk about here in a second. The only real con to the Zap Glove is that these are fairly rare. You're not just going to find these. I don't know of any enemy that actually just uses the Zap Glove regularly. Maybe the lobotomites can at certain levels, but they would be the only ones that I would think of. There's maybe some other enemies that I'm missing, but I just don't see the Zap Glove like at all. So usually I'm not just getting the regular Zap Glove. As for perks, there is no specific perk that helps out with these, but all the general unarmed and melee perks that help out with melee and unarmed apply to these weapons. Slayer to attack faster, Super Slam to knock down enemies, Purifier to kill certain things like Deathclaws and Super Mutants and Ghouls, and Piercing Strike so that you can punch through more armor are all fantastic for this build and any unarmed and melee build. For an overall rating for the Zap Glove, I'd probably put this one up into B tier. It's a decent overall unarmed weapon, but an unarmed weapon that I don't really use all that often. Let's move over to the Paladin Toaster, its unique variant. This can be found right outside Helios 1 if you just go to the left side of the building as you're coming up to it from Novak. There is a cave right there. You go inside the cave, there's a couple Super Mutants, and you can find the Paladin Toaster in there. So you can get this one actually really early on or into the mid-game of New Vegas, which is really nice. This one requires 75 unarmed and 4 strength in order to wield, same as the regular one. This one does more damage at 41, more damage per second at 67, more crit damage at 41, has a 1x crit modifier, still has 28 action point cost, still weighs 6. This one does have less item health than a regular Zap Glove though at 80. So that's kind of interesting, and it does the same amount of robot damage and power armor damage to all enemies that the regular Zap Glove would. This is just a straight upgrade to the Zap Glove overall. Yes, the item health is a little bit lower, but that probably won't matter since this one can be repaired fairly easily, especially if you're into the mid game and you get a perk like Jury Rigging where you can fix it up with any other unarmed. Then it's perfectly fine, and this is actually a pretty decent unarmed weapon. I don't think it's one of the strongest unarmed weapons overall, because I tend not to use this over something like the regular Ballistic Fist, or something like Greased Lightning. I think there is a couple other unique weapons that are a bit better in this. Pushy's another one that comes to mind, where there are just some better unarmed weapons, but this one's not bad by any means. I would put the Paladin Toaster probably up into A tier. It wouldn't be bad to carry this around just in case you want to punch robots or want to punch the Brotherhood, I guess. So would I recommend the Paladin Toaster? Sure. Paladin Toaster's pretty good. Zap Glove, okay. Probably won't go out of my way to get it, but it's decent enough. Tell me your thoughts on the Zap Glove and the Paladin Toaster down below. I will occasionally go and grab this if I'm going to run to Old World Blues because it is kind of a nice little damage buff if I want to run there right away. This one is nice, although I can do the same thing with Pushy, and I would argue Pushy's a little bit better, but sometimes I will occasionally grab the Paladin Toaster just to play around with it. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Displacer Glove and Pushy. These are two of the very last unarmed weapons that we need to talk about. I guess besides our bare hands, but I probably won't make a dedicated video to that because your bare hands are generally weaker than most of the unarmed weapons, but they're not a terrible weapon overall. The Displacer Glove, on the other hand, is actually a really good unarmed weapon, and this is probably going to be one of the mid to late game unarmed weapons that you're finding. The Displacer Glove can appear on a couple different enemies. You can also buy this from a few places. The main enemy that I associate the Displacer Glove with is Caesar himself because this is what he has, although his guards all have Ballistic Gloves, so you would probably argue that the Ballistic Glove is a little bit better. It has higher base stats, but the Displacer Glove does have some of its own unique advantages. So let's go over the stats of the Displacer Glove. This one will require 100 unarmed and 4 strength in order to wield. Fairly low strength, which I think is one of the biggest bonuses to the Displacer Glove. It doesn't take very much strength in order for you to have this be pretty effective. 100 unarmed, you can rush pretty fast, especially if you're going with a dedicated unarmed build. This one does 50 damage on hit, which is pretty high, 68 damage per second, which is also pretty good, 50 crit damage, same as its regular damage, a 1-time crit modifier, which is average, costs 28 action points, pretty much the standard for most unarmed weapons, weighs 6 weight, and has 100 item HP. These stats are all around pretty good. I would consider the Displacer Glove just kind of an upgrade to a regular Power Fist, although you might not consider it necessarily an upgrade to other Power Fists, like some of the unique ones, or even the fully modded out one. They are fairly similar then, at least if you want to compare those two. And since Displacer Gloves are somewhat later into the game, they may not be worth going for unless you're running specifically a lower strength character. And the unique version of this is even better. It also has its own visual effect, although the visual effect doesn't actually grant you any extra damage. It's not like the Zap Glove that we talked about not too long ago that will do EMP damage to robots. It's a very similar visual effect to like the Ballistic Glove, where it can somewhat blind you if you're punching enemies at close range, but it's not as bad as like the Zap Glove is. For the major pros of the Displacer Glove, this one does have good damage and good damage per second. It is an all-around pretty decent unarmed weapon. Major con to this one is really just that it's rare. You're not really going to be able to find Displacer Gloves too often unless you want to rush and kill Caesar, and then you can take it off of him. That can work. The Brotherhood can sell these. I think there's a couple other vendors that can sell them too. I'm not real familiar with the Displacer Glove since generally I skip this and either go with the unique version because it's fairly easy to get, or I end up going and just getting like a Ballistic Fist from Caesar's guards and I just use that instead. There are quite a few perks that help out with this. The general perks that help out with melee and unarmed are all here, so Slayer to attack faster, Super Slam to knock down enemies, Purifier to kill things like Deathclaws and Super Mutants, and Piercing Strike to punch through more armor. All of those are fantastic perks to have on an unarmed or a melee build, or both. And the Displacer Glove overall is a pretty decent unarmed weapon. I do kind of like this. I like the visual effect of it, and it does have pretty good stats. For the Displacer Glove overall, I think I'd probably put this one up into A tier. I think it's pretty decent. It's not one of the best unarmed weapons, and like I said, usually by the time I'm getting it, I would just go with the Ballistic Fist, which I think is a little bit better than it. But it's not a bad option, especially if I'm not running a very high-strength unarmed character, which is kind of unusual since melee and unarmed go so well together, and melee does benefit from having extra strength. So it does feel kind of a niche, especially if you don't want to be primarily going with melee and unarmed, but it does feel a little bit awkward compared to some of the other unarmed weapons. Let's talk about the unique variant of it called Pushy. Pushy can be found all the way up north at Ruby Mine Inn. This one you can actually rush to right away if you want to go there. It actually won't take you very long if you're willing to run up around the Black Mountain shortcut and then head on straight to Vegas, because then it's just up the way a little bit past the plant vault, and then it's one of the mines on the right hand side as you're going up towards Jacobstown. Once you go into there, then it will be full of Lake Larks, which is a pretty scary enemy, especially early on, because they can do a lot of damage with their sonic attacks. But assuming you can just run past them, or you can kill them and then get to the end of this, you can find Pushy on the body of a raider. And Pushy is a very strong unarmed weapon. This one also requires 100 unarmed, but only 2 strength to wield. It's actually one of the lowest strength requirement unarmed weapons, and just one of the lowest requirements for any weapon, which makes it great on really any character, because even if you're going with a single strength character, getting 1 strength is really easy, either from using chems like buff out, or just drinking will get you 1 strength. You could also just have power armor on, weapons handling makes it so you can use this, having the reinforced spine from Old World Blues, or getting the strength implant, all make it so Pushy becomes a pretty viable option. You still probably want high unarmed to use it, but the strength is a very low requirement. This one does 60 damage per hit, which is pretty high, 88 damage per second. This one does attack seemingly a little bit quicker than the regular Displacer Glove. This one does 60 damage on crits, has a 1x crit modifier, costs 28 action points, weighs 6 weight, and has 120 item HP. And this one can be an absolutely fantastic weapon if you want to rush it. Not too long ago, I did a run on New Vegas where I was using dead bodies only and weapons that I found on dead bodies, and they had to be specifically on bodies. As soon as I found Pushy, the game became a lot easier, because I just basically switched to that as my primary go-to weapon for anything close range, and it kind of just beat up everything. So Pushy was quite a strong option there for that particular build, and this one is all around just really good. I would put Pushy probably all the way up into S tier. I think it's a very good unarmed weapon. May not be my favorite, because I think I'd rather go with the Ballistic Fist or the Fist of Rar over this one, but Pushy is still a very solid one. And again, if you're going with a low strength character, then Pushy can be fantastic. Or if you're doing a kind of a weird run like I was doing, can also be a very, very strong weapon. Today we're going to be taking a look at 2 weapons in New Vegas. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Ballistic Glove and the unique version of it, the 2-Step Goodbye. So the Ballistic Glove is in the base game of New Vegas. However, the 2-Step Goodbye is a Gunrunner's Arsenal weapon, so you will need that DLC in order to get it. The Ballistic Glove is only used, I believe, by Caesar's Legion's guards. They're the only ones that have Ballistic Fists that I'm aware of, and nobody really sells Ballistic Fists. I think maybe the Great Khans might, but they're about the only ones that I can think of that would sell the regular Ballistic Fist. This one is a explosive gun on a glove that you can punch stuff with. This will then explode and deal damage to whatever you hit with it. It has a really cool effect. It's a really cool weapon overall. This is actually not the first time we've seen this weapon in the Fallout series, since it's technically in Fallout Tactics as well, where in that one you actually did have to load in shotgun shells into it. This one you don't actually have to load things into it, although that would be really cool if you could load like 12 gauge into this. So this one requires 100 unarmed and 9 strength to wield. I believe this is the highest requirement out of any unarmed weapon in the game, which makes sense. You do have essentially a cannon strapped to your arm that you're punching stuff with. There are real-life gun glove things. I don't know how practical they are or how often they were actually used, but they're usually small caliber guns. This seems to be a much larger caliber gun. This one does 80 damage on hit, so it hits extremely hard. 87 damage per second, so it doesn't attack very quick, but it still has good damage per second because of its damage per hit. This one has 80 crit damage as well, which is extremely high crit damage. It makes it so you can do a lot of damage with this one. 1x crit modifier, so no extra crits here, but still standard crits are quite nice, especially if you're hitting sneak crits. This one only costs 28 action points to use for some reason. It's actually quite good in VATS, and I don't know why. This one weighs 6, so it is kind of heavy for a unarmed weapon, but you only need to carry around 1 of these, so that might not be such a big deal. And the Ballistic Glove has 80 item HP, which isn't the highest. It can break fairly fast, but once you're getting these, you're probably going to be mid to high leveled, in which case you'll probably be able to fix these up, especially if you have jury rigging. Then they're really easy to fix up, since then you can fix it with any other unarmed weapon. For the pros of the Ballistic Glove, this one does really high damage per hit, as you would kind of hope for. This one also has pretty high damage per second because of how high damage per hit it has, and this thing is just really cool. I really like the Ballistic Glove. It's one of my favorite weapons in New Vegas, at least for an unarmed weapon. It is really cool, and there's a lot of cool unarmed weapons in New Vegas. Major cons to these, though, are that they are very rare. Like I said, I think only the Legion Guard really have them, and maybe some vendors like the cons might sell them. I honestly haven't checked. Usually I just get them off of the Legion Guards and use those ones, and these do have low item HP. So if you're not at high leveled or you don't have jury rigging, this one can be a little bit more of a pain to fix up or find people to fix up because it's going to cost you a lot since these are fairly expensive. There are also quite a few perks that help out with these, basically all the unarmed and melee perks that we've talked about before. So Slayer to attack faster, Super Slam to knock enemies down, that one's really strong with this one. Piercing Strike in order to punch through armor, which you might not need with this weapon, but hey, you might as well have it. And Purifier to kill things like Deathclaws and Super Mutants. The Ballistic Glove can kill Deathclaws actually quite easy, especially if you have high action point cost, and if you're running perks like Super Slam or Paralyzing Palm where you can knock them down and kill them really easy, because if they can't fight back, it's really easy to beat them to death. The Ballistic Glove I think is one of the best unarmed weapons in the game, and the regular Ballistic Glove I'd put all the way up to S tier. I think it's fantastic. Now let's move over to the unique version, which is called the Two-Step Goodbye. You have to buy this one from the gun runners, and it's going to cost you a lot. This one is one of the max priced weapons, similar to like the Bowser, so you're not going to be able to get this super cheap. It's going to cost you a lot even if you have very high barter, and even though making money in New Vegas isn't particularly hard, this one is still going to take a chunk out of your cash. So the Two-Step Goodbye is actually quite a bit different from the regular Ballistic Glove. This one also requires 100 unarmed and 9 strength in order to wield, so very high requirements as well. This one does 70 damage per hit, less than the regular Ballistic Glove, 76 damage per second, which is also okay based on its damage. This one only does 10 crit damage rather than the 80 crit damage that the regular one has. The reason for this is that this one actually has a 4 times crit modifier, being one of the highest, if not the highest, out of any of the unarmed weapons, as well as this one costs 28 action points, same as the regular Ballistic Fist, weighs 6, and has 80 item HP. So all around, this one just seems like it has lower stats than the regular Ballistic Fist, which is true. However, this one does have a unique effect of when you kill an enemy with a crit, then you can put a bomb on their corpse, and this will then explode after a few seconds. This does damage to everything in the area. You are not immune to this. It's also really easy to ragdoll yourself with this if you're not paying attention, because it's pretty easy to step on your own explosives this way. This might not do a whole lot of explosive damage, but it still will do damage to you. This one is arguably worse than the Ballistic Glove most of the time, because the explosive on a kill doesn't matter a whole lot of the time. Since the fight might be over at that point, you might just hurt yourself. You can hurt yourself with it, whereas the regular Ballistic Fist, you don't have to worry about that one. The Two-Step Goodbye is a little bit awkward. However, on my recent run where I did 10 times the enemy spawns, the Two-Step Goodbye is actually pretty good because you're fighting so many enemies that you can actually get pretty good value from it. It's just in the regular game, you're usually not swarmed by enemies over and over again, to where this is really going to make a huge difference. It can kind of help for small enemies, clearing them up a little bit quicker, but most of the time this isn't like really needed. So the Two-Step Goodbye I'd actually put lower than the Ballistic Fist. I'd put this one into A tier because it still has really high damage, and it is still a very fun weapon, even though it might be a less practical weapon. I think the regular Ballistic Glove is just a better way to go out of the two of them. And that'll do it for the Ballistic Glove and the Two-Step Goodbye. Tell me your thoughts on these weapons. I know some people absolutely hate the Two-Step Goodbye, so I'm wondering where you would put that on your list. Most people really love the Ballistic Glove, though. That one is really cool, and I enjoy it too myself. The Two-Step Goodbye I find fun, but it is flawed. So I'd love to hear your opinion on that. Thank you guys so very much for watching this. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye, everyone.